Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Johnson. I'm co-senior programmer here at Planet in Focus, and we are here with Canadian director and editor Jennifer Abbott. Jennifer is best known as the co-director and editor of the documentary The Corporation, which examined large corporations in the 21st century. Planet in Focus is so proud to be presenting two of Jennifer Abbott's films. Her latest films are The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel, and the film that we are going to be discussing today, which is The Magnitude of All Things. In The Magnitude of All Things, Jennifer channels the sorrow she feels of losing her sister to cancer, and examining and using this to examine the gravity of climate change, paralleling personal grief with that experienced on a planetary level. So welcome, Jennifer. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us today. And hello, and where are you coming in from?
From Vancouver today.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me and for screening both my films. Yeah. I
Thank you.
wanted to just actually, I have to say that the New Corporation is co-directed with Joel Backen. Just
Right, yes.
important to note.
Of course. So today we're going to be talking about the magnitude of all things. So there are a lot of elements to this film, but it is grounded in something that is very personal to you. Tell me about the process of translating the grief over your sister Sally to a more existential level about the environment and climate change, and what you found it was in these reflections that made you want to translate this into a film.
Mhm. Well, it's very much as stated in the film itself. It was really a moment in time where I recognized the feeling of grief that I was experiencing as I saw what I thought was snow falling, understanding it was actually ash from a climate change related fire, and really recognizing that emotion uh, because I had gone through that territory previously when I lost my sister. So it was a moment, a real sort of revelatory moment for me where I went, aha, this is grief. What I'm feeling is grief for the loss of the world as I know it. And I know that emotion, similar in tenor, but not intensity, when I lost my sister Sally in 2008. I was working at the time on the idea of another film related to climate change. And I'm very much of the persuasion of Amitav Ghosh, who wrote a great little book, The Great Derangement, where he's not little in terms of just little small. It's got a lot of really actually quite big ideas. Where it's like questioning, like, why is not every single piece of art, media, culture, film, like in some way addressing the climate crisis? Because it is so, it is really the loss of the world as we know it, right? And so I was working on another film about climate change, but then that moment when I understood that I was feeling grief related to the loss and of the world as I know it, I went, this is an area of climate change that's really not being explored the way it needs to be. And it was at that moment that I decided to try and make a film about the emotional and psychological dimensions of the climate crisis, and entering the story through the lens of witnessing my sister's journey with cancer and her passing, and how she faced her deepest fears and sorrows. Because it's really my belief that, we all have to learn to face our deepest fears and sorrows about what's going on a planetary level before we can actually make the kinds of changes that we are being called to make.
Tell me about this choice of using her self-realizations as a guide through this story. Use a lot of very beautiful visualizations of your memories with her, and some of her own, I guess, letters to friends and family. How did you sort of use that as a guide to kind of go through the story?
Right. Well, My sister actually asked me to do something with her letters before she passed away, and I had no idea what I would do, and I'm sure she didn't envision this. uh, but when I made that first connection about grief, I then sort of started to look at her letters in more depth on this sort of level of trying to compare personal and planetary grief, and uh, I started to notice there were so many parallels. And like, for example, let's take the subject of hope. She really identified that hope was at times for her actually not her friend, like that it took
Mm.
her out of the present moment, that it made her project into the future, and that it was better if she could just embody what is, and really be present to what is, and that was actually a mode of being that, in a sort of ironic way, was the most hopeful, right? And similarly, I think I really try and present a much more nuanced idea of hope in the magnitude of all things than we see in other films, because there's a real pressure to make films that are hopeful. But to me, hope can be a form of denial itself. And with regards to the climate crisis, if we have hope, it might mean we aren't willing to make the kind of sacrifices or changes that we need to make. If we have hope, we might think somebody else is going to deal with the crisis, right? Sometimes you have to actually lose hope and then rise from the ashes and then act, transform your difficult emotions about the climate crisis into action, let it fire you up. And sometimes, hope comes from losing hope, and then hope becomes a practice, and hope becomes a verb. So that's just one area where, and people can, actually, this is a Q&A, so people will have seen the film, hopefully. And, there's a lot of different parallels like that. And that's how I weave the two stories together.
Certainly, a few characters, notably your sister and Greta Thunberg, obviously another one that spoke to this reinterpretation that I thought was really fascinating of the idea of hope. And perhaps we shouldn't just look at it as kind of like a blanket to cling on to, but maybe there's other ideas around the notion of hope that are a bit more truthful. So maybe along that thought, perhaps we can speak to some of the different characters that you found in their stories, because this film unfolds through quite a few characters that are from many different backgrounds, many different geographic areas, often whom are experiencing big ecological devastations themselves. And you speak to all of these characters on a personal kind of basis about their experiences. What was the common thread that connected all of these characters together? And what were you sort of looking for in finding the people that you wanted to speak to these kind of ideas of grief and hope throughout climate change?
Mm-hmm. Well, the common thread is we visited all of these climate front lines and talked to people about how they were feeling, right? Which is actually quite unusual, right? And so people aren't generally asked that question. And, in terms of the stories we chose to cover, it was, really important to me that, they felt intimate and honest, and that, we had so many people. I just sort of fell in love with everybody that we visited, actually. And, people were so courageous and so willing to be vulnerable on camera, and just really share their experiences, because they're on the front lines, right? They're sort of where the rest of us will be. As I say, I'm in Vancouver, and, we've had smoky skies here the last month, sometimes so bad that you can't actually even see across the street. So, and that's not the first time, right? This is sort of the third time in the last 4 years that we've been in this situation. So, obviously climate change is impinging on more and more people in these direct ways. But, the people that we spoke with, it's, it's their landscape is melting around them, or going up on fire, or the coral is being bleached, or the ecosystems are going extinct. So, these are people that are really, really feeling deeply about the changes all around them. And many of them have devoted like decades, most of their adult lives, to trying to preserve those places that are then being lost. Right. So it was a very emotional journey, as you can imagine. But I'm so grateful to the people that are in our film. As I say, I really fell in love with everyone I met, and just felt a real responsibility to share their stories uh, in an authentic and real way.
Mm. Yeah, they're quite powerful and emotional stories. Did you have a strong sense of how you would approach these conversations with the characters, or was it sort of like a very more open-ended kind of conversation that was just kind of structured around these sort of ideas of grief that would just kind of see where they went with them?
Mm. Well, I think when I'm interviewing people, I sort of know what I want to ask them, but absolutely, it becomes just this organic process that uh, shifts and is dynamic depending on what people share with me. So it's a very dialectic process and back and forth. So because I think as documentary filmmakers, if you have to allow those sorts of gems that you find in the field to transform you and transform your film, right? So that absolutely happened, and people said things and did things I hadn't anticipated that are in the film, and some of them are the most powerful moments.
What were some of the biggest, what were some of those moments? What were some of the biggest lessons that you learned about making climate change that you hadn't maybe considered yourself? And what resonated with you about how some of the characters may have processed their grief around climate change in different ways?
Mhm. Well, I think two characters that come to mind in a similar way is the former president of the Republic of Kiribati, which is an island nation that will likely be submerged by 2100, uh, Anote Tong, and then Greta Thunberg. And both of them, uh, like, they were so present and focused and had such extraordinary integrity. They just sort of lifted everybody around them up. So that was, um, so I really think I witnessed how purpose, uh, in terms of their knowing exactly what their role was in terms of trying to um, avert the worst of the catastrophic predictions. They were like, right, and so that was a beautiful experience to witness people like that. Uh, Auntie Pat and Uncle Kevin, the Wanarua traditional custodians, it was very important to me that we hear from Indigenous voices in that part of the world. It was very hard to find them. And it was a bit of a, okay, from here to here and here, and they were quite wary of us to start with, and trepidatious. But then by the end, I just feel like I got really fortified by them. And, Uncle Kevin is this big man and gave me the best bear hug ever. And really, like, I felt really fortified by him because he was just, again, I think it's like in a very different way than the Anote Tong and Greta Thunberg. He just, even though he was, as I think everyone is in the film on some level, I think, and I think everyone is, that really sort of understands the magnitude of what we're facing. You know, there's an element of, um, well, despair, really, but just that people can, as I said earlier, it's like you rise from those ashes, and I just really felt that was the case uh, with Uncle Kevin and Auntie Pat, and then Manari Ashugwa and Belen Paez and Patricia Guyanga. Like, again, just such strength in the face of loss. And I mean, I could just actually list every single person, really, because there were just so many things to learn. I really loved the rebellious spirit at Extinction Rebellion, and I think Roger Hallam is really right. Like, it's a courageous stance to, uh, he to howl with despair, right? Which is basically,
Yeah.
that's what that says, right? And Ashley Consolo as well was extraordinary, and has been is a completely on the forefront of this field, this new multidisciplinary field of the psychology of climate change, or the ecological grief. And she also was just with her insights and how profound she spoke about these issues, along with Sarah Becky and Derek Pottle and Marjorie Flowers. So there, I don't want to just list everybody, but I kind of feel like I really could. People contributed so much, and I learned so much. And I think ultimately from all of them is, that this process is a dynamic process. It's not like and I can say that for myself too, in terms of ecological grief. It's not that it just stays the same, right? It's like, sometimes I'm in more despair, and then other times I'm buoyed and I have that same sense of purpose, right? And I think it's just very dynamic, and I saw that in the field a lot too, and but it takes a lot, I think, to keep up the resistance and keep up the strength in the face of it all. But so many people are doing that, and that's a very hopeful thing.
Absolutely. What do you think we gain by reflecting and processing climate change on a more visceral level? Because I think that's really what I felt from the film, rather than an intellectual one that's sort of more like fact and figures based. Do you agree with the sentiment of many of your characters that we are more apt to act and promote change when we're sort of more motivated on an emotional level?
Well, I think, really my motivation to make the film was that I recognized, and I'm not the only one, that, I guess the biggest punctuating moment, 1988, when James Hansen addressed Congress and made this appeal. And ever since that time, scientists have been ringing that alarm with greater and greater intensity. But to what effect, right? Things are getting worse, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, some things are improving for sure, but if we look at the trajectory we're on, it's not going in the right direction. So, I really asked myself, well, why is that the case? And I really do feel it's the case because the scale and violence of the climate catastrophe is just too big for us to really face. It's a very, very difficult thing to face emotionally. And so I really wanted to try and make a film that enabled people to, step through that door that understandably they might be reluctant to step through. It's scary, it's depressing, it feels very precarious, and it's so uncertain. And human beings generally want to avoid all of those things, again, understandably, right? And so, but I really do feel that if we don't face our deepest fears and sorrows about the climate crisis, we're spending a lot of our energy, possibly quite unconsciously, pushing it away, right? And I mean, it takes a lot of energy to push that away, as it takes a lot of energy, and I think we do as a culture push away our own mortality, or the notion that life is impermanent and we are all going to die, and we don't like to think about that, and we spend a lot of time distracting ourselves from that, right? But and that's why there's this similarity, I think, in terms of facing one's mortality and facing climate change. I think there's a similar emotional journey that we have to undertake, and that is explored in the film, right? So I feel like if we don't face it, and if we don't accept the reality that is upon us, no, we will never make the kinds of changes that are needed. We will never be able to sacrifice the way we will be called to sacrifice. Not that it's only going to be sacrificial. I mean, can be great things about a transition to a renewable economy, and that's not the subject of my film, but I just want to make that point. It's not all, like, the transition doesn't have to be this terrible, dire gloom thing, right? Where we're all being asked to live a horrible life. Quite the contrary, right? That's sort of another nice thing about the possibility of transitioning. But I really do feel that if we don't face it, that's been and the fact that I mean, it's kind of a little bit strange, honestly, to live in a world where some people that you're in contact with sort of understand the magnitude of the crisis upon us, and then some don't, and it's almost like these parallel universes. And I think it's really hard for people that are deep in the trenches of it to coexist, like, because it just all feels so surreal. Like, why are we all going around as if things are normal? Of course, now they're not normal because of COVID, which is another related subject, but that we could talk a lot about. But I'll stop there.
Well, um, I mean, I do. You are launching. Sure.
Oh, sorry, my AirPod fell out.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, this isn't sort of like a typical climate justice movie, in that there's sort of a direct call to action. In this film, you seem to be sort of inviting the audience to think differently and have conversations on more of a philosophical and really emotional level.
Yeah.
So how do we begin to start addressing these conversations, and what do you think we need to do to think differently?
Oh, well, I think that the film, I hope, sort of answers that in some ways. I think, we have to start to face the reality that is in our midst, right? And act accordingly. So how do we do that? I think it's different for everybody. And of course, there's no sort of, I want somebody to take this away from this film. There's a broad spectrum of possibilities, I hope, of how people walk away from the film and what they choose to do or choose not to do. But ultimately, I guess I just hope that it engenders and provokes some reflection and about really some of the biggest questions there are. Ashley Consolo talks about how climate change asks a lot of humanity, right? It actually, I hope that the magnitude of all things actually provokes people to ask questions about what it means to be human, even, right? And to question the modernity project, because that's the project we're all immersed in, where we think life is just going to get better and better for our kids and subsequent generations. And climate change is called into question all of that, as is explored in the film, right? We're not actually in control. We don't, we're not nearly as smart as we thought we are, and we've made a lot of mistakes, right? And so climate change asks us to be different. I think that's perhaps the foundational question, is how do we want to be different? And the answer to that question will be different for different people. But also, I want to note that, I really hope that because of that conversation related to, um, how climate change casts this light on the way we've organized society, that, that there's also the implicit critique of the system, right? I think we've really been conned into, um, thinking that our agency is as consumers, and having electric cars and energy efficient light bulbs, which are great things, not saying don't have those, but ultimately we have to work together collectively to change the system, because that's really the only way we're ever going to make the kind of, um, you know that's the only way we're going to transform things at the scale, at the meta level, that we really need to transform things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that sentiment. Um, Now, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't ask, but you're launching two incredible, beautiful films at a very strange time in our kind of
Yes.
contemporary reality. So, what has it been like, kind of putting these films out into the universe in the time of this global pandemic?
Yeah, it's been strange. Yeah, and I mean, I live part time on the Gulf Islands, or I was living in the Gulf Islands for 20 years. I'm now part time there. And I had, before I left, this sort of little private screening of Magnitude outside under the almost full moon and the stars, with friends. And that was really lovely. Uh, but it's absolutely been quite anticlimactic. We just had some in-person screenings at fifth, and of course only 50 people are allowed in the theater. So it's strange and surreal, just like anything seems to be these days. But I mean, obviously in the grand scheme of things, it's as a complaint in comparison to how so many people are suffering. It's nothing. But I will admit that it's strange. Now, at the same time, I'm very grateful that, for one, I had two films that were pretty well finished production by the time that the pandemic hit. So I was in post production. I was busier than ever during all of that time, but very fortunate that we had finished production for the most part. And then, secondly, that people can watch films.
Yeah.
They can't go to live theater. They can't go to you know dance shows and things like that. So at least it has a life, right? And I'm very grateful for that too. And it seems like both of my films right now are very, very much relevant to the crisis that are in our midst. And so I feel very privileged to have a voice at this time related to these issues.
On that note, I just wanted to thank you, Jennifer, so much for allowing us to screen both of these incredible films, and for speaking with me here in depth today about The Magnitude of All Things. It's such a personal film, and I feel like we're very blessed that you were able to sort of channel all of those things to get to a sort of deeper place that, we could. I think it's a very new place in the conversation of climate change, and I'm sure it's not an easy film to sort of present all the time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being creative and finding a way to have a film festival in these times and to screen the film. And thank you to everybody that's watching, taking the time to watch the film too. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.